Hi everyone, welcome back to Learn with me. I'm Deborah Hanson, and today I'm going to be covering all the essential knowledge you need to know for 1.6 Scales of Analysis for AP Human Geography Unit 1. So on this slide, you're going to see all the key terms that are important for 1.6 Scales of Analysis. I have a separate video for these where I do definition, real life example, and exam tip for each of these words so that you can make your flashcards or whatever you do to study these key terms, because literally I say this all the time, but the key to the five is knowing your key terms. So really important to find a system. We're here in Unit 1. Find a system so that you can actually learn those, memorize them, but not just the definition, be able to apply them to an FRQ or even an MCQ for the exam. So before we get to the CED question, I just want to thank everyone who's liked and subscribed to the channel. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. The numbers are going up. I love seeing it. I love the comments, love the emails. Thank you. I really do like hearing from all of you, and I hope that you are finding this helpful. If you do, leave me a comment below letting me know what's working for you or what you would really like to see. Maybe me do something different or add some new videos. Whatever you need, I am here for you to prepare you for the AP exam. The CED question that we need to know for this unit is define scales of analysis used by geographers, and scales of analysis include global, regional, national, and local. So we're going to start off by talking about scales of analysis. Scales of analysis are the different levels geographers use to study places and patterns. These range from the local scale, which looks like small areas in like a single city, all the way up to global scale, which is the entire world. So why does it matter? Scales of analysis help us see connections. For example, local events can impact larger regions. At the same time, global trends like trade or climate change can have huge effects on local communities. So here's an example. If we study climate change at the global scale, we can see the big overall patterns of rising temperatures worldwide. But if we zoom into the local scale, we might see how one town's farming, water supply, or economy is directly impacted by those global changes. So the key takeaway is that changing the scale of analysis changes what patterns and relationships we see. So geographers use different scales of analysis to study patterns, and each scale reveals something new. So we're going to start at the local scale. It focuses on like small areas like a neighborhood, a town, or a city. And at this scale, we're looking at the daily life, the culture, and the land use within a community. So for example, studying traffic patterns in one city helps us understand how people move around locally. Next, the national scale zooms out into the entire country. Here, the focus is on politics, economy, culture, and policies that affect the nation as a whole. So, for instance, U.S. immigration laws impact population patterns across the country, not just in one city. And now we move to the regional scale. A region is bigger than a city, but smaller than a whole country. Regions often share unifying traits like climate, culture, or economic activity. So, for example, studying agriculture in the Midwest of the US or examining religion in Middle East are both regional scale studies. And then finally, the global scale. This is looking at the whole world. At this level, we focus on big patterns and connections across countries such as trade, migration, climate change, or cultural diffusion. So, for example, global warming is a worldwide issue that impacts countries everywhere. The key takeaway is that the scale you choose changes what patterns you see. Local details might disappear at the global scale, but while global connections may not be visible at the local scale. So now we're going to look at what insights scales of analysis can provide. Remember, scales of analysis are just the different levels we can use to study a problem, whether it's local, regional, national, or global. Each level gives us a different perspective. At the global scale, we can see big patterns and worldwide trends like global warming or international migration flows. At the local scale, we can see specific impacts on individual communities or neighborhoods. For example, how one town might struggle with water shortage. The most important part is that using multiple scales together helps geographers see both the causes and the solutions. A problem that looks local, like a water shortage, might actually have national or global causes, like government policy or climate change. So the big takeaway is scales of analysis helps us to see the different dimensions of the same problem and connect local issues to larger global processes. We're going to move on to talk about map scales now, because of course we use a lot of maps in geography, right? A map scale shows how distances on a map compared to real distances on Earth. Basically, it tells us how much smaller the map is compared to reality. There are three main types of map scales that you need to know for the exam: verbal scale, And this is the written out in words one, where it says like 1 inch equals 1 mile, or the graphic scale. This is shown with a line or a bar that represents real world distances. You can use a ruler to measure along the bar and you can compare it to the map. Or the last one, ratio or fraction scale. And this uses numbers like 1 to 100,000, which basically means 1 unit on the map equals 100,000 units in real life. Why does this all matter? Map scales are important because they let us measure distances, compare the sizes of places, and understand spatial relationships more accurately. Without scales, maps wouldn't be useful at all for navigation or analysis. Okay, so now let's look at cartographic scales. A cartographic scale shows us how measurements on a map compare to real world distances. These can be written in three different ways: as a ratio, 1 to 100,000, as a verbal scale, 1 inch equals 1 mile, or as a bar scale that shows distances visually with a line. Here's the key points to remember. Small scale maps show large areas but with less detail, like a world map. Large scale maps show small areas with more detail, like a city map. This is a classic AP exam question, so don't get tricked by the wording. Large scale equals more detail, small scale or small area equals less detail, big area. Understanding cartographic scales is essential because it helps geographers accurately read maps, compare places, and analyze spatial data. Scale of inquiry is about the level at which the question is asked or studied. For example, whether it's at the global or regional or national or local level. It's not just about data. It's about how broad or specific the geographic question is. Here's why this matters. The scale of your question determines the kind of data you're going to need and the kind of answers you're going to get. Asking the same question at different scales can lead to different insights. So, for example, if we ask, how is climate change affecting coastlines? The answer will depend on the scale. At the global scale, we'll look at the worldwide impact on coastal cities. At the regional scale, we might focus on Southeast Asia. At the national scale, we could study Florida's coastline. And at the local scale, we could zoom into Miami neighborhoods to see how sea levels affect people directly. So the big idea here is that the scale of inquiry shapes your perspective. A broad scale question reveals global patterns, while a narrow scale question shows local detail. So another key term you need to know in this unit is aggregation. So what is it? Aggregation is about how data is grouped or summarized, whether by region, country, state, city, or even neighborhood. The way that data is aggregated changes the patterns that we see on a map. So this is why it matters. More aggregated data, larger areas, means less detail. So for example, if we only look at income data for the entire US, the country may look wealthy overall, but we miss the variations inside cities and states. Less aggregated data, smaller areas, means more detail. So for instance, at the neighborhood level, we can see how income varies block by block. So it's harder to generalize about larger trends. Let's use some examples with income. At the national scale, the US looks wealthy overall. At the state scale, we notice Mississippi has much lower income than New York. At the city scale, we can see New York City has both very rich and very poor neighborhoods. At the neighborhood scale, we see variation block by block. The big takeaway here, the level of aggregation changes the story the data tells. Too much aggregation and it hides important local details. Very little aggregation gives details, but it makes it harder to see the big picture. So another thing you have to know is scale mismatch. Scale mismatch happens when the scale of inquiry, the question you're asking, and the scale of data you're using that they don't line up. This can lead to inaccurate or misleading conclusions. So for example, it's like trying to understand neighborhood traffic patterns using only a countrywide highway map. The data doesn't match the question, so you're not getting the right information. This is why this matters. If you use a scale that's too broad, you're going to miss important local details. If you use a scale that's too narrow, you might miss big picture trends. Both situations can lead to wrong decisions or misinterpretation of geographic patterns. Take this example. If the question is, where should we build new flood defenses in Houston, Texas? But you only use a national scale flood map, you're going to miss the neighborhood level risks. This is scale mismatch. The big takeaway here, always make sure the scale of your data matches the scale of your question. So now let's look at globalization. I'm sure this is a term you've heard many times in your school years. We use this a lot in social studies. Globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of people, businesses, and cultures across the world. It happens when ideas, goods, services, and technologies spread beyond borders, linking the world economically, socially, and politically. So, what does globalization look like in action? First, cultural globalization. Eating sushi in Paris, watching K-pop in Brazil, or celebrating Halloween in Dubai. Economic globalization. A car might be designed in Germany, built with parts from Japan, assembled in Mexico, then sold in the US. Technological globalization. People around the world using the same social media apps like TikTok or Instagram or YouTube. Political globalization. Countries cooperating through organizations like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Here's a great example, a great real world example of all of this. McDonald's is in over 100 countries, but it adapts to local cultures. For example, India has a McVeggie burger. Japan has a teriyaki burger. This shows how globalization spreads ideas globally, but can also adapt locally. Here in Dubai, we have a McArabia. The big takeaway is that globalization connects us in many ways, but it also creates a mix of shared global culture and unique local adaptation. So that's the essential knowledge that you need to know for 1.6 defined scales of analysis used by geographers. Scales of analysis will include global, regional, national, and local. If you found this information helpful, please hit that like and subscribe button for me. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. Thanks so much for listening today. See you next time.